All right, welcome everyone. My name is Emily Nickerson and I'm the Director of PWYP Canada. I'm so glad you could be here today for this joint PWYP Canada and PWYP US webinar. Just a reminder, as you just saw, the session is going to be recorded and we'll be sharing the recording by email following the webinar. As we kick this webinar off, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with both your name and your organization. The energy transition is ramping up, and we all know this, and there's now high-level commitment within the US government to proactively transition the US economy and energy system away from fossil fuels. Despite this, legal and regulatory frameworks in the US and Canada are woefully lacking in handling this massive shift and stewarding a transition that is just and equitable. Underpinning many of these regulatory failures is a foundational lack of transparency. We have insufficient information on many important issues, including how this transition will happen, who will benefit, the risks associated, and who will pay for the transition. To ensure this transition is just, we need more transparency on a whole range of topics, from unfunded liabilities to government revenue projections and exposure to transition risks, to plans on prioritizing fossil fuel in frontline communities and providing job commitments for workers and emissions reductions. Publish What You Pay and our constituent members are currently strategizing across all of these transparency needs in an effort to coordinate across these issues and ensure that our collective expertise in transparency and accountability can contribute impactfully to the global movement for a just transition. So today, this webinar is going to focus on recent progress and windows of opportunity for joint advocacy to push for transparency needed around environmental liabilities and fossil fuel upstream operations and reserves. Speakers are going to discuss what is the information needed and why it is important, how does this information help inform a just transition, and what do we need to do to achieve disclosure. So with us today, we have Megan Egler, Mike Tolsch, Kathleen Brophy, and Spora Berman. We'll start off with Megan and Mike discussing transparency needs related to environmental liabilities, then transition to Kathleen and Spora, who will discuss these reserve disclosure needs. Reminder to speakers, please keep your presentations around 7 to 8 minutes so we have enough time at the end for questions. I'll raise my hand once you have about 1 minute left. For the audience, make sure to write your questions you have for speakers in the chat, and we'll come back to those following presentations. If you have any related resources from your organization that you want to share, it would be great if you could post these in the chat window for everyone joining, since this is really meant to be an opportunity to learn together and find opportunities for collaboration. So let's kick it off discussing liabilities. In the US and Canada, just 1 second, sorry. In the US and Canada, unfunded oil and gas liabilities continue to mount at an alarming rate. These liabilities, including orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells, are important not only due to the relevant environmental consequences, but also because of the financial cost associated with a lack of corporate accountability. This means we need stronger financial assurance mechanisms combined with increased transparency and oversight on these issues to ensure that we are not only allowing companies to privatize the profits while socializing the costs of their operations throughout the transition. Before Megan and Mike dive into on these issues of liabilities, I just wanted to tell you a bit about them. Megan Egler is a contract researcher at Parkland Institute. She has a PhD, a fellow at the Gund Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont, and a scholar activist. Her dissertation research explores narrative and identity in energy futures and just transitions with a focus on the reclamation and reuse of oil and gas infrastructure. Mike Tolsch is a senior engagement and policy analyst at the Shareholder Association for Research and Education. It's a leading Canadian nonprofit organization working with institutional investors to develop and implement responsible investment policies and practices. SHARE's mission is to build investor power toward a sustainable, inclusive, and productive economy. So Megan, I'll turn it over to you to start it off. I'd love to hear more about your experience looking into the Government of Canada's $1.7 billion contribution to clean up orphaned and abandoned wells last year, of which 1 billion went to Alberta, and whether this was more than an industry bailout, some of the transparency gaps that exist, and what's needed to support a just transition. So over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be here. So I was contracted by the Parkland Institute in collaboration with Oxfam Canada to have a look into last year's federal COVID-19 stimulus for the oil and gas sector in Alberta. So today I'm going to share with you a few of the challenges this research exposed in regard to transparency and open data on part of the government. So a little bit about the funding and the program, just so we're on the same page. So as was stated, this was $1.72 billion of federal funding that was announced shortly after the WHO declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. This funding was part of Canada's COVID-19 economic response plan and was intended to address the dual goals of both employment and the environment. So environment meaning the significant and growing environmental liabilities in Canada. However, this funding was categorized as a fossil fuel subsidy by both the International Institute for Sustainable Development and the Environmental Defense Canada. So more than half of this funding, $1 billion, went directly to the province of Alberta, which makes sense considering the scale and history of oil and gas activity in the province. So a few numbers around that: the Alberta Energy Regulator estimates the province to have about 330,500 wells, of which more than half are no longer producing. So that's 97,000 inactive or suspended wells, 71,000 abandoned wells, which are inactive wells that have been permanently sealed. It's also worth noting that these are conservative estimates, with one study citing upwards of 250,000 inactive wells in Alberta alone. So the site rehabilitation program, which I will call the SRP from now on so that I don't stumble over it. This was a program intended to administer this $1 billion given to Alberta through providing grants to oil field service contractors for well, pipeline, and facility closure and reclamation work in the province. And since this was all done with a fair bit of haste, the Alberta government adopted this incremental approach. So rolling out grant periods of $100 million each, with the exception of period 5, which was $300 million. And then I haven't heard much about the other $200 million. So to date, there's been 6 periods totaling $800 million. So a couple important things to note before we go into the transparency issues is that it's the contractors who apply for this funding, not the producer who is the owner of the well or the infrastructure. Periods 3, 4, and 5, however, gave allocations to producers. So meaning the dollar amounts were assigned to active oil and gas producers in the province, and then contractors could apply for grants up until the allocation amount was reached. Also, there were a number of mechanisms within this program that were intended to address different issues within the oil and gas sector. So for example, unpaid municipal taxes on part of the producers, low Indigenous participation in the oil and gas industry generally, and also the program aimed to reduce the percentage of companies becoming insolvent and those wells falling into the orphan well category. So my research overall, it suggested that most of these mechanisms were not sufficiently meeting their intended goals, and that the program fairly clearly is in violation of the polluter pays principle. However, I did run into quite a few challenges when it came to transparency and open data that make it difficult to paint this as a full picture. So key transparency gaps. I think we can probably all agree here that open government data is meant to create transparency and accountability, as well as increase participation and enhanced governance. However, data around this program, the SRP, and industry activity presented both barriers to availability and usability during the review of this program, making it difficult to assess whether or not the program was meeting its expectations. So in many cases, there existed enough data to suggest that the program was inadequate, but not enough to make conclusive claims, which I suppose could be reason in itself that government may not have wanted to prioritize collecting or making public and appropriate data available. So to give us an idea of what I mean here, the funding from the federal government had 2 goals, main goals, jobs and environment. This was echoed also by the Alberta government with a focus on Indigenous economic participation as well. So when we're looking at employment, the number of jobs being created through the program was updated on the website, the Government of Alberta website weekly. Government officials who I spoke through email had no problem explaining to me the numbers, how they're calculated and what they meant. However, the performance measures used internally by the government, such as the number of Indigenous employees or subcontractors engaged in the work, was not publicly available, nor was the data that would be required to assess the quality of the jobs or who these jobs were being created for. When we're talking about environment, there is no prioritization of sites based on environmental factors within the program, despite the environment being positioned as a major beneficiary. As well, environmental outcomes were not included in the internal performance measures and they were not being tracked. So this is particularly interesting because there are several potential environmental benefits from well closures, including reduced risk of groundwater contamination, ecosystem restoration, and importantly, methane emissions reductions, which is a priority of both the Alberta and Canadian governments. So there were also mechanisms within the program that allow Indigenous community members and landowners to nominate sites for cleanup. This is great. However, this was not, I could not assess this essentially because there was no information on which sites were being worked on, who these sites belong to, or whether any of these sites had been nominated. So at the end of the day, I would say despite many justice-related and environmental claims being made in regard to the program, given the transparency gaps and the lack of public data, there simply was not enough information to say that this program was not simply more than a handout to the oil and gas industry. Interestingly as well, there were numbers showing huge financial benefits to some of the biggest oil and gas corporations. So this table shows the producer allocations in period 4 and 5, courtesy of the Narwhal. This data comes from industry information intended for the oil field service contractors applying for the program so that they could coordinate grant funded work with the producers. However, there isn't any information on periods 1, 2, or 6, which did not have these allocations for the producers. And the grant disclosure data from the Alberta government only shows grants dispersed to the contractors and not what is actually being received by the producers by way of relieving environmental liabilities that otherwise are the legal obligation of the corporations. So here are some more numbers. This table is summing the producer allocations in periods 3, 4, and 5. So as an example, we can see that CNRL, a company that reported an average $1.9 billion annual net profits over the last 10 years, actually received $100 million in funding from the SRP. So it's 1/10 of the entire funding. So the SRP, I would say, is an example of something I would describe as a missed opportunity. There's efforts towards remediation of inactive oil and gas infrastructure. They do hold promise in reducing environmental risks, repairing social and political relationships, and restoring trust. And they also provide employment as we transition away from fossil fuels. However, given the power of the oil and gas industry in Canada and the United States, I think transparency and open data will be necessary to ensure justice within energy transitions. So coming out of this, I have a few recommendations. The first one being corporations, I would say, are unlikely to prioritize sites for any reason other than their profit motive. So for government funded programs that intend to address justice related or environmental factors, there needs to be more oversight on which sites are being prioritized. And this is likely to also require a better understanding of environmental risks associated with inactive wells. We also need to know the location of historic wells, which certainly is a problem in Canada in some places and also in the United States. And we also need to have a better understanding of the methane emissions coming out of these. I would say having justice in energy transitions also means allocating funding directly to Indigenous communities for work on Indigenous lands. The SRP allocated money for work on Indigenous lands, but not necessarily directly to the Indigenous communities themselves. And then secondly, we just need more public data and financial disclosures that are relevant to assessing the programs in question, and especially for those mechanisms within programs that claim to address power dynamics between industry, landowners, and the communities that these extractive activities take place in. There certainly is a lot of public data out there. The Alberta government has an open data platform. However, not all this data was actually relevant to the questions that were important to be asked when we're looking at these types of policies. So hopefully I didn't go over my time. I will say thank you, and I'm excited to hear what the other speakers have to say.
Thanks so much, Megan. I'm going to quickly transition it over to Mike, who's going to dig more into this issue of liabilities disclosure.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about briefly are issues with the valuations of environmental liabilities and basically their potential impact on our collective ability to achieve a just and rapid transition. Because in a just transition, I think we can all agree that vulnerable communities and taxpayers are not the ones left to bear the cost of cleaning up a mess created by oil and gas. That obligation falls to companies, and that obligation is well-founded in law under, I think as Megan mentioned, the polluter pays principle. However, a question that has people rightfully concerned is whether these companies will have the ability to meet these obligations, and if so, for how much longer? Because there are a number of factors that have created these conditions. I think one of them is the way in which oil and gas companies have accounted for the value of their fossil fuel assets and liabilities. And so what I'll try to do is give a few examples of how we've seen that play out on corporate balance sheets and in financial statements. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was how environmental liabilities are apportioned over time. Because an important thing to keep in mind with the way that asset retirement obligations are valued is that companies tend to project these obligations well into the future. So, a company might have hundreds or thousands of currently inactive wells on its books, but might project the costs associated with those well cleanups over a 50 or 60-year period. And the ability to spread those costs out over decades drastically reduces their net present value. So, for example, a $20 billion pool of environmental cleanup liabilities that gets spread out or apportioned over a 60-year period might show up on a financial statement with a present-day value of only, let's say $1.5 billion. And I do want to note, at first blush, those timeframes might seem ludicrous. 50 or 60 years is really not in line with what's happening on the ground. However, they are based, financial accounting practices are based in large part on precedent. And a precedent that I would say is created by a regulatory framework that frankly doesn't impose anything stricter. And so, as an example, in 2019, British Columbia introduced timelines for how long a well can sit dormant before it needs to be sealed and cleaned up. Similar regulations, I think, also exist in Texas and North Dakota in the US, but nothing of the sort exists in Alberta. And, as a result, some of these inactive wells have been languishing on the landscape for decades. In fact, the oldest inactive well in Alberta, and I double checked this morning, it's still listed, dates back to 1918. So without regulatory obligations compelling companies to advance their timeframes, companies are pretty much at liberty to decide when they will reclaim their wells, which means they can push the timelines for cleanup as far off into the future as they choose, and which allows them to spend less money in the present, but also reduces the reported value of those cleanup costs. Another thing, and I think that Megan touched on as well, is that oil and gas companies have significant leeway in terms of which wells they choose for reclamation. In financial terms, in meeting their ongoing obligations to retire wells, companies have an extremely strong incentive to prioritize what I would say is the lowest hanging fruit. They're more likely to reclaim wells with lower cleanup costs rather than those that pose the largest environmental risks. That not only allows companies to push more expensive liability costs down the road, but also allows them to report liabilities based on average cleanup costs that likely don't reflect reality because they're, again, saving the more expensive cleanup costs for a later date or ignoring them. And I think something that's important to mention and something to keep in mind is that, the rationale, the underlying rationale for this staged open-ended reclamation process is largely economic. Companies will and have claimed that they may reactivate a suspended well when drilling costs are reduced or there's an oil price boom. But not only has this rationale not been borne out in practice, in a low carbon world with much lower prices of oil, it becomes even more untenable. And I think recently the Alberta Energy Regulator has unofficially projected that the number of inactive wells in Alberta, and again, this is their worst case scenario, so I will couch it in that. They have suggested that the number of inactive wells could double from the 90,000 plus number that Megan cited to over 180,000 by 2030. And while that is the worst case scenario, according to them, that figure is a few years old. So that worst case scenario is likely even higher today. Another thing that I think it's important to keep in mind is how the cost of liabilities can get distorted by practices developed in and for a high carbon world. Because I think the recent IEA scenario, their net zero scenario, as well as yesterday's events at Shell and Exxon are a couple of good examples of how rapidly the public debate around climate change has shifted, just in the past year alone. But that doesn't change the fact that many of the rules that still govern liability management in the Canadian energy sector were written during a time when high oil prices and high demand were expected to be the norm in perpetuity. And I think the same is true for many accounting practices. And, I think a very good example of that is the well bonding regime in Alberta. Typically jurisdictions require companies to post full financial bonds upfront as an assurance so that the company is liable for reclamation costs if they become insolvent. Whereas in Alberta, a financial bond is only required if a company's liabilities are greater than its assets, which again are determined based on the financial value of the company's oil and gas reserves. And not only does that run the risk of overstating assets if, as many people expect, oil prices become consistently and historically low, but it also incentivizes the production of more and more oil and gas to pay for existing liabilities. And so effectively, and in my opinion anyway, any system that pegs the ability to pay for cleanup to a company's ability to drill for more oil and gas is fundamentally incompatible with a world in which fossil fuel production is on a permanent downward trajectory. And so, just to wrap up, from a transparency standpoint, investors, that we work with, but I think also the public at large, need to know how companies are prioritizing the reclamation activities, and also how cost estimates and timeframes are aligned with reality. And I would say a reality that could shift very quickly due to the economics of oil, but also if regulations in places like Alberta are brought into line with other more stringent jurisdictions. However, I don't think we can assume that those regulations will evolve without continued and significant outside pressure on both companies and regulators. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm sure we'll definitely come back for questions. Okay, so we're going to quickly shift gears and start talking about reserves disclosure. In order to curb warming, we must urgently reduce emissions to ensure we stay within the global carbon budget. The 2019 UNEP report states that global oil and gas production must drop 40% over the next decade in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, as both kind of Megan and Mike have alluded to. And this means that we must not only phase out many existing projects, but we also have to prevent industry plans for new projects in order to avoid a race to the bottom by both companies and governments that puts the global economy and climate at risk. and so we need improved reserve disclosure. So we're going to dig into these issues with both Kathleen and Spora. So Kathleen marshals the technical expertise at PWYP US with 40 members in her coalition. She joined PWYP US in 2019 and comes with considerable experience in the oil, gas, and mining sectors. She's worked in the past for Oxfam America and Transparency International Uganda. She's passionate about supporting the rights of communities to oppose extraction and fight political capture at all levels to enable policymaking that truly puts people over profits. And then we'll follow up Kathleen's presentation with thoughts from Spora, who's been designing and winning campaigns in Canada and internationally for 25 years. She's currently the International Program Director at Stand.Earth, the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Committee, and co-founder of the Global Gas and Oil Network. She's also an adjunct professor at the York University Faculty of Environmental Studies, and we're so thankful that she's here with us today. So I won't waste any more time. Kathleen, would you jump in with some of your thoughts and kick us off on a discussion about the transparency needs related to reserves?
Sure, thanks, Emily. And I'm so happy to be going before instead of after Spora, who I've heard speak many times. So, phew, good thing I had a hand in designing this order. I'm also really glad to be going right after Mike, so we can go from accounting wonkiness to more accounting wonkiness. I'm actually so excited. Thank you for your presentation. Today, I'll be talking about the economics of the transition and the transparency from fossil fuel companies that is required to ensure a managed decline away from fossil fuel heavy financial markets and economies, rather than a transition marked by otherwise avoidable economic shocks. So a lot resonates with me about Mike's presentation. So I'll try to make this a bit more tangible. Many of us have lived through multiple economic crises. At least a few so far in my lifetime. These were crises that eliminated people's life savings, led to thousands of jobs lost, and widespread economic demise for those least responsible for the crises themselves, right? So many of those crises were marked by two things. First was the inaccurate or misleading information from those responsible for creating the crisis, which at least in one instance included banks intentionally misrepresenting risk to continue to make short-term gain while ballooning the eventual consequences for everyone else. And second, a complete lack of accountability after the crisis for those offenders. Not only a lack of accountability, but even further, a bailout, which in the US case used taxpayer money to clean up their negligence with very little consequences for those responsible for the economic hardship of millions of people. Our focus on fossil fuel sector climate-related financial risk disclosure is an attempt to prevent this from happening again, which in this case would be a financial and economic crisis fueled by misinformation from fossil fuel companies. So within the broader set of kind of collective work on climate-related financial risk, we feel that a sub-focus on fossil fuel companies is important, given that this sector is such a key source of risk that is generating risk that reverberates throughout the rest of the market. So to the degree that we're not getting accurate information from fossil fuel companies, those failures will affect the ability of other financial actors to report on and ultimately mitigate their climate risk as well. So to get a bit more specific, to kind of build off of Mike's points on liabilities, which is a huge set of issues, I want to talk about the way oil and gas firms are valued. So a company's value is determined based on its reserves. So how many actual oil reservoirs, basins, and therefore barrels of oil does your company have claim to? And one of the fundamental issues here is that fossil fuel companies are historically and still currently incentivized and rewarded for something called, for a strong reserve replacement ratio. So since oil is finite and each well will dry up, a company has to show that they're regularly replacing the oil that they're depleting with new reserves, right? Because that's the commodity that they're getting all their value from. So pro-growth is therefore inherent. So what our task is when it comes to climate change is to almost reverse the way that financial health is measured in this industry. So this is obviously due to what Emily said, the fact that in order to meet our climate mitigation goals, we have to stay within a reasonable carbon budget. So we can't afford to bring new projects on, but even more so, many of the existing projects that are already accounted for in companies' balance sheets are not going to, must be stranded early, meaning phased out prematurely. And it's important to remember here that this will happen no matter what the companies want to happen, or what is moral, or what is what our politicians want. It's a market. And so the energy market is shifting, as we all know. One form of energy is displacing another. And so stranding of assets will happen. And if we don't get the information that we need in order to better understand this, to see which assets and projects are most likely of stranding, and make investment decisions accordingly, we will face avoidable and painful economic shock, since in essence, the value of oil companies will be mispriced, which is what leads to market bubbles. So what do I mean by mispricing? This means that this is based on the fact that companies are currently required to value their reserves based on current economic conditions and historical prices. So a company represents the economic producibility of different reserves and projects using a price structure required, which is the average monthly price of the last 12 months. So while this was originally a proxy to help standardize what is normally really volatile price fluctuations in the oil sector for the purposes of disclosure, it's simply inappropriate for a market that is in terminal decline. Given this, we need to adjust what is required of companies so that more forward-looking information is required in disclosures. So what long-term assumptions are companies using when they're declaring that a project is going to be economically viable for the next 20 years? What future prices are they projecting, and does that have any basis in reality? We also need disclosure of scope 3 emissions from company reserves, which colleagues on the phone are working on, which will help provide some of the information about likely stranding as well. Currently, companies disclose things like this. I'll paste in the chat the way Chevron talks about this, which is basically, hey, just in case you were wondering, we're doing all of this internally. We're doing all this modeling, and it's all proprietary, so you can't see it, but trust us that we know what we're doing here. And when we say that we're profitable, we're using kind of any sort of rationality. And that's simply just not going to cut it, especially given the history of the sector, basing a lot of its survival on coordinated and intentional disinformation. So as we've seen, like I said, the company has a long history of spreading coordinated, specific, and intentional information to keep itself afloat. Therefore, we're working to require mandatory disclosures to help rectify some of these misinformation issues. So we're targeting financial regulators like the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, which is responsible for corporate disclosure requirements in the U.S. These regulators can and must require expanded disclosures from these companies if broader climate-related financial risk mitigation is going to be successful. So on the company side, we can start to better understand what the fossil fuel phase-out will look like, so that investors can then adjust their investments accordingly, and companies can be valued according to the trajectories to meet a 1.5-degree pathway rather than a business as usual scenario. I have absolutely no intention of bailing out Darren Woods or any other fossil fuel CEO who knows so much more about the market transition to come than I do, and the changes that their businesses need to make in order to kind of prevent these economic shocks. Hopefully with information and much more, we can prevent that from happening. Thank you.
All right, Sephora, I'll turn it over to you to keep us going on this discussion around reserves disclosure.
Wow, fantastic. That was really great. I was so focused to listening, I forgot I was speaking. I'm like, this is so great. All right. Let me just get this on view. Do you see one big slide?
It looks great.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Sephora. I am on the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations in Vancouver, Canada. And I want to spend just a couple of minutes introducing you, in case you haven't heard about it, to the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative for a couple of reasons, and then I'll go into the work that I've been helping do on reserves. Specifically, I wanted to introduce you to the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative because it is a directed network campaign that now includes over 400 organizations around the world and growing really fast every day. The campaign's now supported by 100 Nobel laureates, 101, including the Dalai Lama, which was really cool. And we'll soon release a letter with well over 1,000 scientists and academics, et cetera. So the idea around the campaign is a directed network that can aggregate and amplify information and create political space and push governments to not only do work domestically to constrain the expansion of fossil fuels, but also in line with the Paris Accord, but also to fast track the conversations and diplomatic streams and research necessary at an international level in order to design a global just transition and fast track the wind down of fossil fuels. So I want to tell you about the campaign and the network here because I hope you will participate and make sure your organizations are. I hope that you'll use the network that we're creating. The network's really active. We have crazy open rates. It's like a big, bold new idea, and now it's captured people's attention. And I think a lot of folks are seeing that we haven't, as a movement, had kind of a big, bold, ambitious demand to government since before Paris. And while there's a lot of energy and steam and amazing work happening in the financial space and all the finance campaigns, et cetera, we can't let governments off the hook and let markets do this. And so I think the network could be useful to you, and also the logic behind the reframing of what we're trying to do on fossil fuels useful to your liability and reserve work. Okay, so we start from the premise basically that we haven't yet addressed production of fossil fuels in the climate policy work significantly, but either at a subnational, national, or international level, and not at a municipal level very much either, though that's starting with the Safe Cities initiative that Stand.Earth is doing, and the work that many groups have been doing with individual cities to stop fossil fuel infrastructure. The point is, the Paris Agreement doesn't even include the words fossil fuels, coal, oil, or gas. It wasn't designed to constrain production, it was designed to constrain emissions. And the theory, of course, has been for 30 years that demand will go down, price will go up, and the markets will constrain fossil fuels and fossil fuel supply. Well, we all know that's not working. So the logic of the treaty is based on, in part, on this. The World Economic Forum has for years shown what the greatest and most likely threats are to the Earth and human communities. In 2000, climate action failure topped weapons of mass destruction in terms of both impact and likelihood of the greatest risk facing the world, and according to the WWF Global Risk Report. Also part of that logic is understanding that we are currently, thanks to the great work of SEI, UNEP, ISD, and others, we now know that we're currently on track to produce 120% more fossil fuels than would be consistent with a 1.5 degree C pathway. So greatest threat to the Earth, climate action failure. 80% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere, of course, you guys all know, come from three products: oil, gas, and coal. And we're on track to produce far more than we could ever burn and still have a stable planet. So this is interesting for this conversation because this graph, thanks to Oil Change International, really shows us what we have in developed reserves. So we already have enough developed reserves of fossil fuels to take the world 2 degrees, should they be burned. And even if global coal use were phased out overnight, cement emissions were drastically reduced, carbon emissions from the oil and gas in operating fields would push the world beyond 1.5 degrees. So I think all of our work changed significantly last week when the IEA finally acknowledged this. Again, thanks to the work of OCI and many others around the world who pushed the IEA to produce a scenario consistent with 1.5. And that's really exciting. But I think what we have to look at here is what's going to happen as a result of this new call, especially for this call with the valuation of reserves. It kills company emissions intensity arguments, which is great for us. I think it will also create a huge new rush to get infrastructure in. It's the green paradox, as many of you know if you're academics, that when you see a policy direction or a significant policy direction, then often what we see is governments and industry moving in the other direction to capture what they can. This is very dangerous for us, obviously. The other reason I wanted to introduce you to the treaty is that it's absolutely critical if we're going to have a global just transition that we have international cooperation. There are many countries around the world that don't have the capacity to phase out or wind down fossil fuels. And that's in large part because they're so overexposed or their economic situation is such that they're drilling for more oil just to feed their debt. And even wealthy countries, many of them, don't want to do it alone. What was it Trudeau said? No sane country would leave billions of dollars of oil in the ground. He's gonna have to eat that soon. But the fact is that there are competitiveness issues, etc. And if countries are agreeing to stop expansion, all of them together at once, obviously those competitiveness issues go away. And that's certainly what the IEA has called for. This chart in particular comes from the amazing work of Greg Mutit and Shivam Kartha, who have produced a really important report on equity considerations in production decline that I definitely encourage you all to read, but I'm not going to go into now. Okay, so the three pillars of the treaty are basically follow the non-proliferation model. Yes, we're trying to create a new social norm around expansion of fossil fuels as weapons of mass destruction. And if the speeches at many councils who have passed treaty motions, show it's really working. These are the contemporary weapons of mass destruction. They threaten all of us, and we need to ensure non-proliferation first and foremost. So an end to new exploration and expansion into new reserves. Second, global disarmament, and third, a peaceful transition. Okay, I'm going to jump to. So we have both a research agenda, a diplomatic agenda, and a global network campaign that is now developing. And I'll put some information in the chat after I speak about that. Our first initiative was to look at our goal of accountability and transparency on fossil fuels. What we realized is it doesn't exist. We don't anywhere, unless you buy it from Rystad and Woodmac and add it up, know who's producing what, where, and how, what's under construction and what's planned. And so we created the idea of a global registry of fossil fuels, put out a white paper, got a lot of feedback over the last while, and then an RFP. We had a number of agencies competing to produce the prototype for the global registry of fossil fuels. Carbon Tracker Initiative and Global Energy Monitor were successful. By COP26, they'll be ready to launch the first iteration of the prototype registry. It will include country-level information on fossil fuel reserves and production for all countries globally, comprehensive field-level data for a subset around 40% of coal, oil, and gas mines and wells, including major polluters, such as the US and Canada. By the way, our analysis shows that well over 75% of all oil and gas expansion planned in the next 5 years is in the US and Canada globally. We'll also be expanding this work beyond COP, obviously, but this first prototype will include comprehensive or near comprehensive fossil fuel reserves and production per company globally as well. Historical efforts to tackle global threats show that transparency and government accountability is the critical foundation and a precursor for any broader international cooperation. And so that's part of why we're doing this. Our expectation is that by developing a global registry of fossil fuels, we're going to meaningfully contribute to driving the uptake of consideration of fossil fuel reserves within multilateral institutions and negotiations, and other potential precursor to other elements of a regime to address a global just transition. More, I would also note before I wind up here is that, you know, we definitely saw Mark Carney and others behind the TC RFD recently successfully applied the principles of greater transparency and disclosure to bring climate risk onto the agenda of finance and investment. Lessons of experience also demonstrate that greater transparency in oil, gas, and coal production ought to be a major contributor towards creating more favorable political conditions for a managed energy transition. So this is what we're doing now. We're building the evidence base, and we're making it completely open and transparent. When this is done, any NGO, any country can log in and see exactly what's happening within every country around the world, and every company in the world. And I'm happy to share this slide deck and just leave more time for conversations. This slide deck shows kind of how the research and data that we're scraping lead into a global political and diplomatic efforts. So we have 2 work streams, a diplomatic work stream. We're already meeting with countries, and we have several countries who are supportive of the global registry, and the UNEP has certainly signaled some interest. And we also have a technical work stream, which of course is just getting up and running, and I've described some of the work that they will be doing. So I hope that has given some food for thought. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. In the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly jump straight into questions. So I hope the speakers are ready. I see some starting to come in here, and I noted some questions from earlier in the conversation. So we'll just start with this one that Laurel from Oxfam has just posted. She's asking, what would an updated North American agreement need to include to keep us on track for a 1.5 degree warming, and especially lay a foundation for an inclusive, fair, transparent energy transition? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that of the speakers. I don't want to assign you.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I got sidetracked by the chat.
That's okay. I can see a lot happening in the chat. So she was just asking, what would an updated North American agreement need to include to keep us on track for a 1.5 degree warming? And she's specifically interested in ways to lay a foundation for an inclusive, fair, and transparent energy transition.
Well, I mean, I'll kick us off. First of all, we need to stop all expansion. That means no LNG Canada. It means no Trans Mountain. It means no new fracking. That's exactly what the IEA said. We can't afford to keep building the problem and saying we're on track to 1.5. And that in order to have a truly just transition, that needs to happen everywhere. And a lot of people say that's a moonshot, but the fact is that when you look at other treaties and other big agreements like this globally, the journey matters. And just proposing a landmine ban or a nuclear non-proliferation treaty creates bilateral and multilateral negotiations. So the US and Canada could make a decision to maximize the existing infrastructure, to maximizing the existing, to join up, for example, grid connectivity between North and South, to problem solve together on some of these issues. And so far, that hasn't happened. Also, we see a lot of unifying between the US and Canada on policy. We should be doing that on by liability and bond issues, as Michael so clearly laid out, in order to immediately constrain methane, and of course fossil fuel subsidies. A lot of these projects would have died, and a lot of these companies would have died. They're operating at the bottom of the S&P, but they're not dying because we're shoveling subsidies that way or artificially keeping them alive. So that really should be the first agreement that we see, I think.
Great. Megan, I wanted to turn to you with a specific question. One of our participants was just wondering more about the gaps that you identified and whether any of the measures that you kind of suggested to address those gaps are being put in place by the Alberta government, if there was interest, kind of what you were hearing in those interviews about a way forward in Alberta to address what you saw.
Yeah, for sure. And I suppose just building off of the last question too, and then segueing into that, the interesting thing about this SRP program and the fact that the funding was funneled through the provincial government is that in a lot of ways it violated a lot of the agreements that the federal government had, and the strings were not there to assure that the funding was being distributed in a way that maybe the federal government would have preferred for it. So it might hold some interesting implications when we're talking about international agreements about these types of things. And then as far as the transparency gaps, so part of the stipulation from the Canadian government to the provincial government was that the Alberta government was to put regulation in place to assure that this problem wasn't continuing of these wells being left inactive or unabandoned or becoming orphan wells. And the government has put in place something new. I haven't heard much positivity around it. However, I did hear that a lot of consultation was had, but I still think that there's an issue here in narrative. I think it's very easy in the case of Alberta for the government to pay a lot of lip service to the ways that they're confronting these problems. But then when we're digging into it, we're finding that they're not actually being confronted. So I personally don't hold a lot of hope for the new liability management framework. Would be interesting to look more fully at it. But again, to do that, we're going to need a lot of increases in transparency and access to the data that the government has their hands on in this regard.
Thanks so much, Megan. And then Mike, we have a couple questions piling up for you in the chat, actually. One of them is kind of asking about the role of regulators to ensure that companies are accurately recording their environmental liabilities and whether there's a role for auditors. And then a second question asking about liquidation hierarchies. And I don't know if you've been able to see that longer question from Patrick. Feel free to tackle whatever you want.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of questions there, but I'll try and, I'll focus on the first question, and specifically, I think the role of auditors is an extremely important and pertinent question that, in the investment space, people are asking how much climate competence some of the the key the big four auditing firms, for example, some of the auditors, how much competence do they have to actually assess some of the assumptions that Kathleen was talking about that companies are making with respect to the long-term prices of oil, the assumptions on natural gas, and just the assets and reserve valuation, the regime in place now it's not sufficiently transparent to a point that external stakeholders, including investors, but others, have the capacity to actually know how certain numbers are reached. And that's where the role of the auditor, and I think by extension, the regulator, becomes crucial, because there's been a lot of push over the last couple of years, and I think particularly led by the TCFD, to increase scenario analysis conducted by these oil and gas companies. Like, what does their long-term profitability look like in certain scenarios? But maybe what we're not seeing enough of is the sensitivity analysis. Like, what actually happens if your key assumptions change? What happens if you're wrong? And that's a question that I think auditors really need to be asking. Like, okay, the regulations in place don't necessarily require companies to report in accordance with a 1.5 or Paris-aligned trajectory. But at least, given the materiality, and as Sephora very accurately pointed out, it's the biggest issue, it's the most dangerous issue we're currently facing right now. Given that materiality, there's at least an obligation to disclose to investors and to the public what happens if your projections over the long term don't turn out to be as sunny as some of your assumptions actually made them seem. So that's my response to that one. But maybe I'll open the second question up to I don't know, Kathleen, if you have any thoughts on that. But Yeah, I think that in Canada, what I can say is the Redwater decision. There was a decision in 20, I believe it came down in 2019, that essentially created a supermajority in front of creditors for environmental liability cleanup. That is a significant decision, but the effects of which we don't really yet fully know. I think the cases that are going through the courts of appeal and potentially the Supreme Court on that issue are not fully known. So, the answer is there's definitely going to be an impact. There's definitely going to be a change in the Canadian landscape. It's just we don't know how, to what extent it will be felt.
Great, and I appreciate that the speakers have been also answering questions in the chat. I know that we're kind of running tight on time. Kathleen, I just wanted to give you one kind of final question before we wrap up. And maybe that's just like the next steps ahead. How do we begin working on some of these massive issues that we're discussing today? What are some of those kind of opportunities for collaboration or short-term wins that you see?
That's a great question. And just to say yes, I just have to follow up with Mike after this call because we have a lot of wonky things to talk about. But I think that it's really important for the transparency movement that we need to remember that I'm sure most people don't need reminding that we are still fighting for mandatory payment disclosure at the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, and it's been a decade. And so while fighting for this regulatory reform is obviously what I just presented on, I think we're going to have to think about other options as well. So these companies are going to sue the regulators. They're going to try to prevent this. They're going to tie things up in courts. We know that that not only leads to delay, but obstruction. And we don't have that time. So I would say when I mean, what I mean when I say we're targeting the SEC, but really we're trying to change the way value is measured, like we need to change the way that the market is working and try to really impact those with the purchasing power to make these changes that force these companies to change. The other big thing I'm very, very worried about when it comes to all of this kind of valuation issues is the carbon capture smoke and mirrors. So I haven't fully yet figured out how to kind of tackle this issue in our recommendations to the SEC. But companies are basically going to keep saying, yeah, sure, okay, now that the cat is out of the bag on the scenarios, they'll now transition to, okay, yeah, sure, that project doesn't look profitable, but now that we're going to integrate carbon capture, it will be. And again, it's just more proprietary, kind of like, well, you guys don't know about it, but now we have this new technology that's going to allow us to keep our projects going on in perpetuity. And so we just need to be one step ahead and trying to think through how to kind of require a full end to all those smoke and mirrors. Thanks.
One final comment from Spora and I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I forgot to mention one new piece of work we're just embarking on, which I think would be particularly interesting to you. We want to look at how many tax dollars does each producing country get per ton of CO2. So these numbers could drive debate about who gets what share of the remaining carbon budget. So the global registry is going to produce the top level numbers, combining our emissions numbers with EITI's tax payment numbers. And if we do this, then civil society at a national level can use those numbers to initiate debate and compare what countries are doing. And I think that could be a really interesting intervention.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. I think that will be of interest to most people on this call. I just want to say a special thank you to all the speakers for being with us today. We really appreciate it. This has been recorded. I'm sure that we can kind of share this further through the network. And I really hope that this is the start of a conversation and we can kind of use this, as I was mentioning at the start, as a place to kind of build some more opportunities for collaboration. One other shout out is that Megan's research will be likely released in late June. So stay tuned. We'll try to share that around as well. If you're interested to kind of see the final results of that research. And as always, please reach out to Kathleen and I if you'd like to find out more about how you can engage in some of this work. We are really looking for partners and support and just excited to continue having this conversation with everyone here. I'll leave it there. Thanks again for your time. and hopefully we connect soon.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.